Welcome to today's episode of the Medical Fitness Podcast, powered by the Medical Fitness Association and MRF Institute. My name is Thomas Hammett. I'm the Director of Operations for Pinnacle Lifestyle Medicine and the co-founder of the Medicine Rehab and Fitness Institute. My co-host today is my friend and colleague, Jeff Young, kinesiologist and co-founder of the Medicine Rehab and Fitness Institute. How are you doing today, Jeff?
Hey everyone, we are excited to have Dr. John Farrell with us today on our show. John is the assistant professor and human performance consultant in the Department of Health and Human Performance at Texas State University. The way I've gotten to know John is that he's on the executive committee for the National Strength and Conditioning Association's Special Populations Interest Group, which both Thomas and I are a part of. As you're about to see, he's extremely knowledgeable, and I'm excited for our upcoming conversation. John, thanks for joining us. To help us get started today, can you share a little bit more about your background with our audience?
Yeah, well, howdy. Thank you all very much for having me on. Super excited. That was a very flattering introduction, Jeff. Thank you very much for that. So, as Jeff mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Texas State University. With a PhD in exercise physiology, and I've done a lot of research in the realm of exercise training and prescription for those with chronic diseases, physical disabilities, as well as working with elite level athletes. So I kind of have a broad range of understanding and research within this realm.
It's great. John, that's it's interesting that you're sharing your background. You actually have a really similar, just in like your brief intro, a really similar story to Jeff and another person that I just interviewed, Dr. Rob Newton, where there's an origin that starts in strength and conditioning, potentially for
Mhm.
athletes or like general population, and you evolved into like working with the special population. Can you tell us a little bit more about like how that transition happened or why you moved that direction where I think a lot of others just stay in the world of like working with athletes or performance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was doing my master's degree at the University of Oklahoma, I was very, very much focused on, that 1% improvement in athletes. But my mentor at the time, Dr. Rebecca Larson, a lot of her previous work up to that point had been working with persons with multiple sclerosis. And the way that I looked at it was like, okay, like I'm very passionate about exercise and physical activity. And there's a lot of individuals out there that there are a lot of barriers that preventing them from being able to engage in exercise training and physical activity at the level that they may want to. And so when I thought about it that way, I got very excited and I'm like, okay, like I can do a little bit more with my knowledge and with my research and my learning and try and be able to not only help athletes, but also help individuals where there's not a lot of resources available for them. And so that idea of being able to help this essentially underserved population to a degree within the realm of exercise and physical activity, in my opinion, was really, really exciting to me and made that transition. And still, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but kind of have been able to kind of meld those two areas to a degree with some of our adaptive sports research.
Yeah, it's great. And you're right. Yeah, we'll get to that coming up here in a second. So prior to the podcast, you shared that your current work has been focused in the area of transitioning from inpatient rehab to reintegration back into everyday life.
Mhm.
Maybe just start, can you tell us a little bit more about this work that you're doing?
Yeah, so when I was doing my postdoc, we were doing a lot of work with really specialized pieces of equipment. So we're doing things such as functional electrical stimulation, cycling, which for those that aren't necessarily aware, it's essentially a device that stimulates the peripheral tissue, the musculature, and allows you to have a more forceful or productive muscular contraction while you're doing cycling. It allows people to exercise at intensities that they wouldn't be able to on their own, and then to um, adequate responses to that stimuli for adaptations. And it was a lot of fun. It was great work, and it had a lot of positive impact. But the area that I really struggled with was okay. Once we're done, or once these individuals are done here at this rehab facility or with this research study, it's likely they will not have access to these pieces of equipment again. Kind of, I don't want to say I got jaded on that, but I think I got a little bit jaded on that idea. It's like I didn't necessarily feel that great about it, and I didn't want to leave that realm altogether. I wanted to continue to try and help individuals, help them eliminate as many barriers to exercise training as possible. And so the realm of adaptive sports really was opened up to me by one of my colleagues, Dr. Ali Thomas, who's a recreational therapist. And she introduced me to that. And I kind of saw that as an avenue to be able to say, okay, we've gotten you to the point where you can go home. You don't need to come and have supervised exercise training anymore. Now it's how do we get you into these group settings where you're able to actually have individuals maybe with similar conditions or at least maybe going through similar situations in their life and participate in sports. Most individuals are going to be very, very passionate and into sports. And if we can take exercise and meld that in with sports rather than just like, all right, I need to go to the gym and do my 30 minutes, 5 days per week, rather than being able to like go and say, all right, we're going to play basketball, whatever that sport looks like, and try and help kind of take the structure out of it a little bit and make it more accessible for those individuals. That's where a lot of my work has been in the last few years, is kind of that, what can we do for individuals once they've left the rehab facility?
Yeah, that's great. You identified, I think, what is a huge problem. I mean, whether it's people who are, um, I guess, like could be participating in adaptive sports or not, there's this like really intensive medical service of exercise that's available for a certain set of populations of people, right? And it can be an inpatient rehab, it could be cardiac rehab, um, and it could just be general physical therapy. And the amount of support and resource you get, like, there's no one outside of this setting that is going to do that NMES on the bike kind of stuff that you were talking about, right? Like that's an
Right.
intensive specialized thing that is not available once you get out of the medical setting. And at a certain point, medical coverage drops, or you are no longer really the appropriate person to be in that service. And the bridge to what's next is like it drops off a cliff. Like
Hmm.
there is nothing that looks like that anywhere. So it sounds like what you've done is tried to identify like what's the best next step for these people who had that kind of support and are trying to figure out like, well, what is appropriate for me once I'm done in that medical setting where I'm getting lots of support and tools.
Yeah. So my one of my main research partners, Dr. Ali Thomas here at Texas State, our group recently published a paper, and we were really going through and trying to talk with the adaptive sport athletes. So individuals that are already engaging with adaptive sports, but what are some of the perceived barriers that they have that makes it difficult for them? And one of the major ones was lack of resources, lack of perceived time, lack of individuals that have knowledge about how to train in a safe and appropriate manner for sports. So I think we do, and this is not a knock on anybody who's currently engaging in adaptive sports or helping facilitate the putting on adaptive sports, but I think we do a really great job of saying, hey, you should be physically active, do adaptive sports. But then there's not a lot of information on like, okay, like how do I do adaptive sports? How do I train in a safe and appropriate manner? Or if you are somebody who is extremely competitive and you do have aspirations of maybe even going to the Paralympics, how do I train to enhance athletic performance in that division or within that realm? And I think that was one of the biggest things that I was noticing kind of combing through the research when I was originally approached about this. Like there really isn't necessarily a whole lot about the actual training prescription for adaptive sports, and it really highlighted a big area, in my opinion, that needed to be addressed.
I have a quick question on this because I'm trying to. I know you live in the San Antonio area, and
Right.
so I'm trying to understand more clearly. Are you speaking from a general sense, or are you also speaking about your local situation where after the studies, like in the just speaking about San Antonio,
Mhm.
are there resources, organizations, I don't know, whatever the case may be, that you, your team, and or Texas State are able to then
Mhm.
connect the participants with so that they can move on, whether it's with sports, whether it's with trainers, et cetera. I'm just trying to visualize a little bit better.
Yeah, yeah. Man, that's a great question. So yes, I am. I'm at Texas State University. We're in San Marcos, Texas. We are smack dab between the two major metropolises that are Austin, Texas, and San Antonio, Texas. in San Antonio and Austin, they both probably probably some of your more how do I phrase it? So in terms of resources, probably San Antonio has a lot more resources than you're going to find across most parts of the world. And one of the main reasons is the military population that is there in San Antonio. San Antonio is constantly ranked as military town USA. There's several military bases in this area, and when you have several military bases, you have a large veteran population. And so we have South Texas VA is right there in San Antonio as well. There's the Center for the Intrepid, which is a private organization funded through DoD that does a lot of adaptive athlete, adaptive sport research. Now, as far as our particular collaborations, we've been very fortunate. Dr. Thomas, she's been working in this area for a long time, and she has been down in the trenches in the community, really building relationships, feet on the ground, working with individuals, helping host events. So, for example, Texas State, we host the Larry Turner Basketball Classic tournament, and it's one of the largest in the country. So we have individuals and teams that are coming from the region and across the country to compete in this weekend long tournament. We're also one of the few tournaments that'll host adults and children for this event. So we have children's teams and we have adult teams that are participating. But we also have good collaborations with organizations such as Lone Star Paralysis Foundation, which helps us put on the Larry Turner Wheelchair Classic, and also Morgan's Wonderland, which is an amazing facility down in San Antonio, Texas, that originally started as an all-inclusive theme park in the sense that anybody with any type of physical disability or disability in general, there's an option for them to be able to participate. And then it expanded out. Now they have Morgan Sports. And so it's a sports facility complex where practices are hosted, regional events are hosted. And so we've been able to work with those organizations. But even then, you still have, San Antonio is a large area with a lot of traffic. And so, transportation is usually a major
Mhm.
issue for individuals if they don't have a vehicle that is fitted for them or they're not physically able to drive themselves. The equipment, the wheelchairs that are specific to adaptive sports, those are extremely expensive and can be hard to be difficult to come across. So we're very fortunate in the sense that there are a lot of opportunities in our area, but there's still a significant number of barriers that are still present. And to a degree, probably will always be present. But if we're trying to come up with creative ways that can help us minimize those barriers as much as possible.
I have one more question for you. Sorry to
Yeah.
butt in there,
No,
Thomas,
no,
but
you're just great.
ironically, in 3.5 hours from now, I'm gonna be in a meeting with a student and then several faculty at Rutgers University, and this student is starting an adaptive program. And
Mhm,
what the meeting is going to be about is me, the potential of I'm going to go to I'm not too far from Rutgers and go there probably in about mid-April and perform a seminar and workshop for really students who are currently certified fitness professionals on. And now
mhm,
adaptive athletes are not my area of expertise, but as you know, prior to hitting record here for today's show, you and I were briefly talking about Kyle O'Toole, who you know
mhm,
well, and that is his area of expertise along with you. And so you know that he and I just had a meeting, and one of the things that Kyle and I talked about was that the person in front of you and their conditions aside, just for a second, whether they're apparently healthy or chronic disease, joint pain, adaptive athlete, the one thing that applies to all the above is that you want to improve strength, power, conditioning, and lean muscle tissue. Four primary adaptations to physiological adaptations to exercise, and that's no different with adaptive athletes as well. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because you talked about briefly, where do they go afterwards? You've been talking about sports resources and stuff like that, but
mhm,
also just the fact that fitness professionals and
mhm.
and aren't learning how to train adaptive athletes. So now my question with that as a background is that also something that you're either doing, you're interested in doing, whether it's your team, whether it's Texas State, and in your area, just trying to up the knowledge and skill set of fitness professionals so that there's more confidence and competency with training adaptive individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like to think so.
Good.
So I think some of that comes from kind of starting with the educational level. So with students that are coming through our program at Texas State, one of the classes that I teach is all about exercise testing and prescription for individuals that are considered special populations. And
Good.
that includes those with chronic diseases and those with physical disabilities. And some of those special considerations that have to be taken into consideration whenever you're programming exercise for these individuals. Something as simple as, if you have somebody with multiple sclerosis, potential thermosensitivity and how you can potentially address that and coming up with creative solutions to help kind of minimize those effects. Or even something as simple as somebody who has a heart condition and they're on beta blockers. Maybe it's not appropriate to use heart rate response as your indicator for exercise intensity. So I think we're doing a pretty good job in the sense of preparing students to encounter these conditions out in their professions. And then also, Dr. Thomas and I have gone to multiple clinics that are hosted in this area. As I was mentioning, we actually have a track and field clinic that we're going to for track and field. And one of the things that we're trying to do while we're there is make sure that we educating those that already out there in the field that are already practicing, like, hey, if you're working with someone with spinal cord injury or someone with multiple sclerosis, these are some of the things that are being considered that you should be taking a look at and maybe considering while they're doing the exercises. But also, we're kind of starting to do maybe a little bit of this may be a little bit off topic, but kind of do a deep dive into like the sport itself. Okay, so let's take wheelchair racing, for example. These individuals are often in a hunched over, compromising type position where it may be actually difficult for blood to circulate, where it may be difficult for them to actually breathe. And so, kind of taking a look at that, like putting some simple things in place and like, all right, it's maybe not a great idea to be in this position for hours on end during a track and field practice or during a track and field meet, kind of figuring out like, okay, maybe there's set intervals where you should only be in this position for so long in order to make sure that you do have appropriate and proper circulation throughout that position. So just little things like that, I think we're trying to do our best to bring awareness to and bring considerations to. And then it's actually really interesting this question. We have a paper that's under review right now that we got really good responses on. It's in press actually, and it was looking at like a multidisciplinary team for hosting a adaptive sport event. So you have recreational therapists, you have physical therapists, occupational therapists, sports scientists, strength conditioning coaches, exercise physiologists. Like, how do these all athletic trainers? How do all of these individuals work together to ensure that there is a safe event? How do they collaborate together? Like, for lack of a better term, who's in charge of what or who should be considering what. It was actually a really fascinating study to sit in on some of the interviews and kind of listen to the different professions, their perspectives on
Love it.
Something I even want to take just a step back because I think this is even something that I didn't have a ton of awareness about before we were going to hit record on this meeting, and I decided to do some research. For the listener who isn't as familiar to adaptive sports, this really looks like any sport that has been modified to enable participation for people with disabilities. And obviously, what we've been talking about are the most commonly known adaptive sports, which are primarily wheelchair sports, right? But there are literally hundreds of different adaptive sports that people can participate in. The VA, Veteran Affairs, has over 20 competitions in Paralympic sports. As you're saying, John, like a community like San Antonio, where there's a large veteran population and active military population, would have and be kind of a hub for that kind of activity. I actually want to go back to something you said because I think because I think it's really important in thinking about that initial question of like, so people leave these inpatient programs or intensive programs, and then what's next? And your answer was, the next step can be these adaptive sports, and not just because the adaptive sport is the exercise that they need, which is true, but it's
it.
also the motivation to do exercise that keeps them fit to do that adaptive sport, right? Like
Mhm.
Doing the wheelchair racing or wheelchair basketball, like you need to have a certain level of upper extremity fitness to be able to perform those sports, and postural awareness, right? Like the stuff you're talking about. I'm curious when we talk about, and maybe I'll ask like specifically the settings or resources that are necessary um, and like where people would go to access that kind of fitness and exercise. Like where do you go if you want to be fit as a, for example, wheelchair athlete? I imagine it's not like your standard gym with, the standard resources for everyone else, but maybe it is.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it's going to come down to like kind of what we were mentioning, like what resources are available. Now, the ADA, Americans with Disability Act, does state like there has to be certain accommodations that are present, particularly like within fitness facilities that do allow individuals with physical disabilities to be able to engage in exercise training. That can be looking at something as simple as, having straps that are available for individuals that have impaired grip strength, or having something such as an arm ergometer for individuals that don't lower extremity or use of their lower extremities. So I think you can go to a typical facility, fitness facility, and still be able to train. I think the issue that a lot of people are going to run into is there's not a lot of resources. Even you look online, there's not necessarily a lot of resources available as far as information on how I should train. Like, what is the safe and appropriate manner for me to train? What are the considerations or the things that could the different physiological responses that I have because of my condition to the stimuli of exercise. And I think that's where a lot of it, at least from my end, is I'm trying to address like, okay, how can we get the information out there to not only the health and fitness professionals, but also to the individuals themselves so that they're more aware of how they respond to exercise. Now, again, we are very fortunate in the sense that we do live in this area for these facilities that are available. And there's extremely, extremely knowledgeable individuals at these facilities and hosting these programs. And again, that's not going to be the case everywhere. But there are facilities. When I was living in Ottawa, Ontario, we had a facility called Neuro Rehab, and it was specifically a fitness facility for those that had a neurological or neuromuscular impairments. So there are these little niche facilities that are popping up over the place to address this. But again, you might not be near one of those. And what we're trying to do, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, some of the research I'm working on, is we're trying to come up with ways that somebody can figure out what their fitness level is and figure out and prescribe exercise in an accessible way without needing to go to a laboratory or to a specialized training facility. Like, we do a lot of this with athletes in the sense like, hey, we want to be able to do something on the practice field that doesn't require a specialized piece of equipment. And we want to be able to do that for individuals that are participating in adaptive sports as well.
John, I would like to, like, after this is over, we need to set up a meeting because I would like to pick your brain on this a little bit further, maybe even collaborate a little bit. I want to go back to this
Yeah.
meeting I have coming up in a little over 3 hours. Part of the reason why the there's some exercise science professors there at Rutgers and the student are really passionate about this is because at the very least in the state of New Jersey, there's very little accessibility as you're
Mhm.
alluding to. You're as you said, you're in a very fortunate situation, but in the state of New Jersey, there's very little awareness and very little accessibility. And they feel like, and I'm sure this is, if you look at the United States as a whole, this is probably the case. So they feel like they're
Mhm.
starting at ground zero, but they want to start, they want to get things started. And then, kind of related to that, the Physical Activity Alliance has been working hard for the last 4 years. And hopefully, they've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, but hopefully it's going to lead to more accessibility and stuff like that. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but about 2 months ago, I founded and I'm directing now a state level. It's called New York Moves, a New York State level implementation of the Physical Activity Alliance's national plan. And this is something that we're talking about in our meetings is the importance of basically the underserved, which is what we're talking about. We're more
Mhm.
specifically talking about adaptive individuals and athletes, but we're talking about the underserved. So yeah, the it just feels like, and I guess that's my question for you. It feels like that you're in a fortunate situation, but that really we're kind of at ground zero and we need organizations like the Physical Activity Alliance and the state level implementations and more colleges and universities to start, getting involved in things like this to help get the groundswell going and get a movement going. Would you agree? Do you have thoughts on that?
The Medical Fitness Podcast is brought to you in part by the Medical Fitness Association. Attention, all medical fitness professionals. Get ready for the event of the year. Register today for the Medical Fitness Association Annual Conference, November 19th through the 21st in New Orleans. Network with industry experts and like-minded professionals from around the U.S. and Canada. Gain insights from leading voices in medical fitness and take your career to the next level. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity. Mark your calendars for November 19 to 21st and join us in New Orleans for the Medical Fitness Association Annual Conference. Register now at medicalfitness.org. That's medicalfitness.org.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The major issue that you kind of run into with doing research within this, well, we're really within any type of chronic condition, is really, do you have access to the individuals
Yep.
to do the
Accessibility.
research? Now, I will say this: I've been in very fortunate situations. When I was at the University of Oklahoma, there was the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation, and there was a neurologist right there who did a lot with multiple sclerosis and helped us. We built a partnership with him, and through my advisor, Dr. Rebecca Larson, built that relationship, and they were instrumental in helping us get those individuals down to our laboratory to do assessments, to answer research questions. Um, Even when I was at Ottawa, there was another hub there. There was a major MS clinic right there attached to the Ottawa hospital, which we were affiliated with. And so, yeah, like there definitely has to be more research done in these areas. But again, it kind of runs into, it's kind of in these hubs, but we're in these hubs for a reason, because that's where the populations of these individuals are, and we're really at the mercy of that. And it could be one of those situations where, kind of like what we're trying to do, is we want to build collaborations across the country with other universities where they may have access to individuals that participate in adaptive sports. And so if we can build these relationships, and kind of maybe what you're talking about at the Rutgers, if we can build these relationships, and really a lot of times what we see is we don't have large sample sizes for analysis. So if we can have multidisciplinary and multi-site research going on, that's only going to be allow us to be able to answer more research questions and really serve the individuals that we're doing. I want to emphasize that a lot of the questions that my team that we're trying to answer here are not just to answer. We're trying to make sure that these are questions that are addressing and will actually serve our adaptive sport athletes.
Good.
Great. John, I'm glad that you started talking about your experience in Ottawa and NeuroFit and the MS population, because the next question I have for you is to segue back to some of the neuro population. But for people with neurological conditions, what are the misconceptions or stereotypes that you'd like to correct about how these people can and should be exercising?
Yeah, so there are general recommendations out there for individuals, particularly like with multiple sclerosis, general exercise guidelines, and I think those guidelines are great. They're a great starting off place.
Mm.
And I'm not trying to knock any of the researchers that contributes that. They're definitely the foundation of which all of our recommendations are based off of. But a lot of times those recommendations are extremely broad, and they don't take into consideration the heterogeneous nature of neurological conditions. Like you can have two individuals that have the same diagnosis, they've had the disease for the same amount of time, but they have very, very different symptoms. That can get lost in those recommendations. So I think what is always a great question, and my advisor, my postdoc supervisor, Dr. Lara Paluti, she got this question one time at a presentation. I thought she handled it great. I've always kind of referred to her answer a lot of times. is she was giving a presentation, and a person with MS stood up, gave her story. It was a very moving story. She asked, like, I have all these problems. Um, what is the best exercise for me?
Hmm.
And I'm running through everything in my head. I'm kind of going through a checklist. I'm like, okay, yeah, this, maybe this. And my advisor, took it all in stride, and she just simply said, the best exercise is going to be the exercise that you're actually going to do. And so really trying to figure out, okay, what is feasible for you to do? We can provide, the most scientifically evidence-based exercise recommendations, but if you hate it and it's not something you enjoy or something that you want to do, they're probably not going to do it. And so we really have to kind of come up with a way of merging those two things. And I think that's kind of where the adaptive sports comes in a little bit as well, is this can be something that people can get passionate about and have a lot of fun. And there's not just the exercise component to it, there's the social component to it. And not a physical activity researcher, but I do have a little understanding of things such as like the social cognitive theory. So the idea of like how do we change a behavior, and having peer interactions and those individuals holding everybody accountable for doing or not doing those actions goes a long ways to changing and modifying behavior. And that's really kind of really important component of this, is trying to understand, okay, what is the exercise, what's the best or the general recommendations, how do we get people to participate in those or at least achieve those. And a lot of it may come down to getting creative, putting them in social settings, figuring out what they're passionate about, modifying those recommendations to meet what they're actually interested in, so they'll actually do the recommendations.
If you don't mind, I'm gonna take this same question. I'm gonna focus it a little bit. So as you're talking and with Thomas as well, one of the things that goes through my mind, and I'm kind of simplifying this a little bit, but you have the umbrella of aerobic exercise, and maybe that's what the person will, and then you can break that down into type of
Mhm.
exercise, etc. Some people like it, some people hate it, and some people will have the ability or access to do it, and some people don't. You have the strength training side or the resistance training side, and then what you're talking about, which I can see you're very passionate about, which is really cool because I grew up playing a zillion types of sports, is the sports side, and it's fun, and the
Mhm.
competition and the social aspect, etc. But just for a second, I want to talk about or ask you about the resistance or strength training side,
Mhm.
because back a while back, there was an editorial piece in the Journal of Applied Physiology titled "What Trains Together Gains Together." Strength training strengthens not only muscles but also neural networks. So we've been on the topic of multiple sclerosis, which again I know you're passionate about. And for the listeners, my wife was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis about 21 years ago. So this is also something I'm really passionate about as well. So in any case, uh, you know, strength training and strengthening neural networks relates to a concept called neuroplasticity, which now leads to my question. I'm curious if you could talk about neuroplasticity and the importance of progressive resistance training for those who are for that focus group who do have access or would have access to something like this and maybe would enjoy it. So what is the importance of progressive resistance training in improving the health of the nervous system?
Yeah, so my understanding of neuroplasticity is l- learning new neural pathways. So always like to use the example in my class is like the action potential from the central nervous system. It may go from point A to point B, but after a catastrophic event such as a stroke or the development of lesions such as seen in multiple sclerosis, that A to B pathway may die out. It's not accessible anymore. So neuroplasticity, instead of going from A to B, you can now go from A to C to B and relearn new pathways through that. Um, for for creating an environment that is conducive for stimulating neuroplasticity, exercise has been shown to be very, very conducive. So I kind of come at it. I'm gonna get to resistance training, but I know more about the aerobic side. So
Okay.
for following aerobic training, there is the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which will circulate around through the bloodstream, and increases in factor circulating around has been has been shown to be correlated with increases in neuroplasticity. So we can also see as the exercise intensity increases, there's larger amounts of brain-derived neurotrophic factor circulating around through the bloodstream, increases in plasticity. You see this with things such as high intensity interval training, and that's what's really crazy now is that we're getting to the point of yes, we know that there are inhibitions in the central nervous system following catastrophic events or following certain chronic diseases. But also, these are all often associated with declines in cognitive function as well. And so we can maintain or potentially slightly improve cognitive function and physiological fitness at the same time with exercise training. Now, from the resistance training side of it, my understanding, and you probably know a little bit more about this than I do, Jeff, but the actual trying to force and propagate that action potential, the recruitment of a large amount of lean tissue mass through the peripheral nervous system, essentially trying to force that action potential down through the spinal cord out to the peripheral tissue. I think that is probably one of the primary drivers of increasing plasticity following resistance training. Is that, for lack of a better term, again, trying to force that action potential or trying to relearn that pathway through that.
Yeah, let me just say real quick that I teach a strength and conditioning course at CUNY York College in Queens. And last semester, Dr. Bill Kramer, I
Mhm,
live streamed him in for a guest lecture, which was unbelievable. And one of the things he showed was, and he actually had in this embedded in a slide a video, I guess, of what is it, the EEG that's looking at your
mhm,
brainwave activity? And it was amazing. It showed someone, this was a probably an apparently healthy person, but doing like m- my guess is somewhere around like a 40% of a 1 rep max. So in other words, light squat. So it was a light squat, and then you could see the brainwave activity as a baseline. And then in the next set, they went up to like 60 or 70% of 1 rep max, and you could see the brainwave
mhm,
activity like significantly increase, and then like a 4 rep max, and then finally a 1 rep max. And it was unbelievable the difference in intensity. As the intensity raised, the
mhm,
brainwave activity raised. And so, look, I'm not a researcher, but uh, just knowing some physiology and Henneman size principle and stuff like that, I just look at it as if it's happening up here, and like you said, then forcing it down. And anyways, as it relates to the question that I originally asked you, it would just seem logical to me that all of this is going to end up leading to neuroplasticity, the creation of new
mhm.
pathways like you described, et cetera, and therefore the improvement of the health of the nervous system. So while I totally agree with you and get that not everybody's going to fall in love with resistance training, we can't make people fall in love with it, but I just do think that, especially for neural conditions, it's really, really important thing to consider.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes back to you, when you look at healthy individuals, for example, not every athlete loves resistance training, but they know that if I resistance train, I'll be better at my
Yes.
sport. And so I think if you like we were kind of talking about, like if you can relate it back to what is somebody's motivation, like okay, like I really want to improve at wheelchair basketball or wheelchair racing. And I know that, I can't just play basketball all the time. I have to do some sort of side of conditioning and some sort of strength training to actually improve in that sport so that maybe I'm not trying to go to the Paralympics about it, but I still want to be able to play and help my team win these local tournaments and stuff like that. I think it's really just figuring out like, okay, what motivates that individual and then showing what the methods are to their improve, then that'll kind of drive them to participate.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think what I'd add to that, John, is that like adopting exercise is not this all or nothing principle where like
Mhm,
you are not doing it one day and then all of a sudden you are doing it 100%. Like that message of the best exercise is to do the exercise that you enjoy or love is a
mhm,
really good, like that is the message to get your foot in the door. Do the thing that you enjoy doing first, because that thing, if it does bring you joy, reinforces why you should do other forms of exercise that keep you fit enough to do that thing you love, right? And that is how you go from like, let's do I don't know, the basic activity that you know you enjoy and need to stay fit for, to starting a resistance training program, to starting to do cardiovascular exercise. For some people, it's like a matter of survival, right? Like, I need to exercise so that I don't fall because I'm on cancer treatment. And, there's no joy to that, but there is a motivation
Hmm.
that this is going to help me survive and maybe live through the treatment that I'm going through that's truly attacking my body. Either way, it's not this all or nothing principle. It's not you're doing it or you're not doing it. It's like there's a pathway to getting people to do more of this stuff. And it does start at that place. So,
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, Thomas, it's down to the health professional to figure out to help identify what that motivation is and then to leverage it.
yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Hey, I have one more. I know we're at least maybe not necessarily completely winding it down, but we're winding it down here a little bit. And I have one more question for you. Um, Recently, I created a post for my social media platforms on what I called the pitfalls of statistical averages. In short, I talked about how most studies report statistical averages, but by doing so, it can lead or it can create a misleading quote unquote uniform picture and lead to a this is how everyone is going to respond mentality. I personally see it all the time in my 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 daily professional life. But the problem with this is that it ignores the positive outliers who may actually demonstrate what's possible if people would just mirror their behavior. In fact, a recent guest on our show who performs research in obesity medicine mentioned that the positive outliers are often those who are more motivated and show better adherence to the study's protocol. So, with that as a lead in, I'm curious your thoughts. And I'm mainly curious if, in your experience, you found that more attention should be paid to the positive outliers with regard to optimizing approaches and driving progress.
Man, that is a topic that me and some of my colleagues have discussed ad nauseum at times. It's like, okay, especially like I've mentioned, like when you're dealing with a condition where there's a very heterogeneous nature to it, everybody's going to respond to the stimuli just a little bit different. Even in healthy individuals, you're going to have slightly different responses, but it can be exaggerated whenever you have a kind of disease in place. So I think to answer your question, yes, I think we should respond or we should pay attention to those positive outliers. And I think we should also look at those individuals that aren't the positive outliers, that are regressing to the average. And I think there's a couple of different ways that we can address this. Is yes, there are serious pitfalls when we're using means and standard deviations. A lot of things can get hidden within those. And so one of the things that we, as part of my research group, we're trying to do was we not only looked at the means and standard deviations, but we also reported individual data or the individual responses. And they kind of, as you were mentioning, like, okay, number of individuals that were positive outliers. Maybe there was somebody that was dragging up the response or dragging down the mean averages and was maybe hiding things within there. I think we can also do a better job of looking at um, and running analysis at the individual level for our research studies. So, not to get too deep into statistical weeds here, but there's several different options that you have for individual statistical analysis. You can do a model statistic, you can do the smallest worthwhile change, you can do coefficient of variation, you can do the standard error of the measure. And all of these use slightly different techniques. Some of them are really just looking at what is the biological variability in this test. Like let's say when Thomas does the time 25-foot walk, what is his biological variability when we do that several times? And then if we do that three times and then we do a fourth time and it's outside of that normal variability, that may be an indication that it is a significant difference. You can also, such as the standard error of the measure, you can simply look at like what is the error associated with doing this test, and then is our difference, is it outside of what that normal noise, for lack of a better term, is associated with doing the assessment. I think for clinical population, those are things that we've done in my group for athletic populations. So like making decisions with some of their data. But for a clinical population, I think one of the major things that you want to look at is the minimal clinical significant difference. So this is the minimal amount of change in a variable that the participant is going to notice and that they are going to perceive as having an impact on their activities of daily living. And there are validated values for a plethora of assessments that are out there. I think that is going to be your more worthwhile change is looking at that type of assessment. Or you can look at an assessment that has a association with improvements in physiological fitness, because we know that as VO2 max, muscular strength, muscular power, as those increase, you do see improvements in activity of daily living. And sometimes our assessments don't necessarily they might not do the greatest a job of being associated with that. But if we have an assessment that where we do see a change in the assessment that is associated with change in physiological fitness, we can figure out what is the smallest amount of change in the assessment that's associated with change in physiological fitness. And so I think that's probably your more robust assessment rather than looking at means and standard deviations. But I think the scientific community is doing a better job of recognizing this and moving towards that. I think there's been a big push to report individual data and to look at those minimal clinical significant differences.
Good. And let me just respond real quick. And I hope I can word this right because, it's obvious that you're a prolific researcher I'm just not. And so, but I also teach an exercise prescription for special populations class. And what I'll tell them, and I don't know if this relates to research because my guess is what I'm getting ready to say is too broad, and it's not something that you could focus from a research standpoint. So it's a little bit ideal. But what I teach my students is that it almost doesn't matter what your condition is or where you lie on the lifespan. There are some universal themes that ideally, if people would just follow them, you're going to improve. There might be some heterogeneity as far as how much you'll improve based on the person's life, their motivation, etc. But the first thing I teach them is lifestyle medicine. And if we would just
Mhm.
all look at our diet and then try to eat healthier, if we would look at our exercise and not just look at exercise as exercise, but at least one of the end goals is to improve your fitness and then to look objectively at that your aerobic fitness, VO2 max, and what does that mean, strength fitness, and what does that mean, and to try to improve those things. So what I'll do with my students is I start with some universal themes. If people would just improve their look at the 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine and try to improve them, if they would just look at their fitness and try to improve strength, power, conditioning, etc., and then if they would look at their diet and try to eat because we can all improve pretty much everything, right? And if we just try to improve it with those as like an overarching umbrella, then that's going to lead to positive outliers. And of course, you aren't going to design studies like that. But I just think the way I look at it is from like a practical, more of a lifestyle standpoint. If people would focus on those things, then it's going to lead to a healthier life, no matter what your condition is. So I don't know if I worded that well or not, or if you understand where I'm coming from, but if so, I'm curious your response.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. I think kind of one of the things I think you're alluding to is okay, like we have these positive outliers, and then we have the individuals that are the quote unquote others that may not be responding to the stimulus or the intervention in the way that the positive outliers are. And I think one of the things that this actually I think presents a really interesting research question is going in and saying, okay, what are some of the characteristical differences of these two groups? Not necessarily that like okay, why are you a positive outlier? And I think it's kind of what you're referring to. It's like okay,
You're
like
exactly right.
you're why are you're motivated? Why are you motivated? And
Yes.
then okay, and then you can take some of that information, some of those characteristics of that, and figure out like okay, let me come back to these individuals that weren't necessarily responders, and let's see like okay, if we were able to take some of the information we got from the positive outliers and apply certain techniques to essentially increase motivation, would you be a positive outlier? So it may not necessarily be a true physiological difference. It may just be kind of what you're alluding to is that there are certain inherent characteristics of individuals that can't be accounted for all the time in a research study. But again, I think that allows us to go in and investigate. Okay, why are these positive outliers and why are these not outliers? What is different about them? If if theoretically they have the exact same
Yep,
physiology.
you nailed it. That's exactly where I was going. I appreciate that.
Yeah, man, that's a yeah, like I said, that's a really interesting research question. If I come up with a way to answer that, I will be you'll be the first person I call, Jeff.
I'm telling you, please.
Jeff, just in response before we wrap it up, like there's so many factors that as John's talking about, and I'd love to actually take some of the quantifiable, like the objective data and apply it to your question. It's just so big, isn't it? Like there's so many factors that could influence someone's ability to make like health change comparing someone, person A to person B, whether it's their health literacy or, their state of health at a given moment, their perception of their own perception of what their health is. And I actually think the ability to give people objective information about their health and like help them understand even just at a base level where they're at is actually generally missing. Like we have health metrics, we have basic health vitals that can tell people about their health state at a given time. But to actually point out like this is your health compared to the average of people, either you are or you are not an outlier. And what what can we learn from those people who are to make decisions to help you get to a different place? I actually think generally that like objectively for the general public is not well done. And that to me is just part of what's missing, like of probably a small part of a bigger picture that is frankly just feels huge.
John, before you respond, and just so you know, I actually created I'm so passionate about what Thomas just said, and I actually created a video on it that I don't. I probably was a little too aggressive in my wording in it, which is the reason why I ended up not really getting it out to the public a whole lot. But I just feel like that's exactly right. There are objective points of reference, and this world is a little bit too subjective, and that we need some more objectivity in it. And what is your aerobic capacity? What is your strength? What are people doing from an and also again, I just don't think exercise science is rocket science, and I think that we can teach, the layperson at least the very basics so they can understand what norms are and where they lie, and then make an informed and adult decision for themselves as to whether or not they want to take a little bit more personal responsibility and with this new information, and maybe that'll actually be a motivator and go, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know
Mhm.
that these were the norms, or this is where I lie as compared to other people, etc. So it's definitely a topic I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, and I kinda struggle with this a little bit because I whenever we talk about this in my classes, we always one of the things that always comes up is education. Telling kind of what you're mentioning, Jeff, is talking to people about like, okay, this is why it's important to exercise. These are the health related benefits to it. These are the health concerns if you don't. And if you look at physical activity levels since 2008, when the original physical activity guidelines came out, they've stayed the same or have decreased. So I kind of struggle with like, okay, is education and knowledge necessarily the biggest factor? It's definitely one of them. I will concede that it's definitely one of them, but I'm not entirely convinced it is the factor because we've been doing that almost 20 plus years or going on 20 years or so now, and not a lot has changed. But from a research standpoint, I think we tend to do a I think we try, and this is the nature of research, is we try and isolate as many variables as we can. And then I try and go through and identify, like, okay, this one is contributing this, or is this one, is this one? It's like, well, it's this complex interaction between all of them, and that is a very very difficult thing to understand and to do research on when you have so many factors that could be contributing variable amounts to somebody's behavior. And again, I'm not a behavioral researcher. I do have a slight understanding of it, and I'm sure somebody will get on here and be like, that's not right, John. I'm like, you're probably right, it's not. But it's a complex topic, and it it's most likely several different variables that are contributing varying amounts to the overall motivation and behavior.
Without a doubt, and just so I'm clear, and since this is the first time you and I are talking about something like this, Yeah, there's nutrition science, exercise science, and behavior science, and we really need to
Mhm.
merge the three. And there's someone I know. Well, Thomas is amazing when it comes to behavior. Sheila Aubois, our partner with the MRF Institute, and someone who I just recently started collaborating with within the ACLM. His name is Simon Matthews, and that's his area of expertise as well.
Mhm.
We actually put in for a co-presentation for the ACLM's conference in near where you're at, in near Dallas, this
Yeah,
upcoming fall, but we haven't gotten word on whether it's approved or not. We decided that if it's not approved, we're probably going to still collaborate on some sort of course or whatever. But yeah, the way I look at it is, and I almost would need to have a visual, for you and the listeners to really get my point across. But I just feel like there's a Venn diagram, and that you need to
exactly.
merge the three, and that it starts with basic fundamentals. And so I
Mhm.
totally agree that it isn't just about, hey, here's what your objective points of reference are from an exercise science standpoint, and then all of a sudden you're going to become motivated, and that was the magic pill to get you motivated or whatever. I understand it's way more complexity to that, but I just feel like if the lay person could be a little bit more informed on the fundamentals of
Mhm.
nutrition science, the fundamentals of exercise science, and the fundamentals of behavior science, and then from there you just have to parse it out based on the person's individual situation. So anyways, I just want to be a little bit more clear on my thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely, yeah, it's definitely a complex interaction, and then
Very complex.
education and people. I kind of struggle sometimes. It's like, yeah, education, but also just caring. Like, it's hard to make somebody care, and that's something definitely that we kind of struggle with. I think in the clinical population realm is like it's trying to motivate and get someone to care about exercising when they're like, I have a plethora of other problems to worry about. And it's like,
Absolutely.
and it's just trying to kind of what you were mentioning, like, okay, like if you do have this point of reference, you do, and we do a decent job of educating you on where you are in relation to where you potentially could or should be for overall health, maybe that'll help you care a little bit more. But yeah, it's a complex behavior. I'm glad there are much smarter individuals out there that are doing this behavioral type research than me.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Thomas, what are your
Great.
thoughts?
My thoughts, to be honest with you, we could talk about this for hours. Like, if we want to get into the behavioral side of things, I mean, even an element that we didn't talk about is like social determinants kind of stuff, or just what's accessible in your community. Like, John's been talking on this call about like what's accessible to his community in San Antonio, and it's quite a bit different than what might be accessible. It's people in rural, Eastern Washington on the other side of the mountains from where I live and where I went to college. Like, that's a big part of this stuff that we didn't get into, and it's actually it does do a good segue into the next question that I have. John, we talked about your kind of like your involvement and lens on medical fitness and medical exercise, and for the population of people that you serve and the research you're doing, I'd love to know where you'd like to see medical exercise be 10 years from now, and what needs to be done to ensure that those options of medical exercise are more accessible than they are today.
Yeah, man. If I my ideal scenario would be that we are integrating more of lifestyle type physical activity and exercise training much earlier on in the rehab process. I think that would do a lot for bridging that gap. And I know there are some clinicians that are out there that are already doing that. But and I also you look at what the VA is doing. The VA has put a big emphasis on adaptive sports right now and making sure that veterans have these type of options once they've left rehab type settings. And so I think if we can start integrating it, introducing people, like explain like this is what's available, and do a better job of identifying those resources that are available much earlier on. And I think the idea of this, I think a lot of people think of exercise, physical activity, and sports as these two separate entities. And I think over the next 10 to 15 years, I think within rehab type settings, I think we're going to be of bringing that gap or reducing that gap and bringing them together and really trying to emphasize the lifestyle physical activity as people are transitioning. Once we get to a certain degree of physical fitness and being able to perform activities of living, what can I do outside of this that, for one, that I'm going to care about, that I'm actually going to do, and what does that look like, and how am I going to maintain that across the lifespan? I think that's where we're heading, is that more integration of the lifestyle type physical activity.
Great. And that's such a this isn't specific to people participating in adaptive sports necessarily. I mean, this is true for
So,
anyone, right? I think there's an age where like I'm in the age, my phase of life right now. I've got a second baby on the way in like 2 months. And I'm squarely in the point of my life where all the people my age and the people around me are not exercising for the purpose of what I would call play anymore. Like we stopped playing a long time
yeah.
ago, right? Unfortunately, it's just true. Like you get out of high school, you get out of college, wherever that like structured play was available to you,
Mhm.
is no longer, and other things take over. And there's ways like even if we just take the enjoyment of the exercise that you're doing as that form of play, like making that accessible to people, whether it's in an acute or post-acute situation or it's just to everybody, is really necessary and important. But I love the emphasis on just generally like people need access to talking about lifestyle change early in the rehab process, throughout the rehab process, and as a goal of the rehab process and whatever that looks like for them. So, John, as we wrap up, where can our listeners go to learn more about you, or how should they contact you if they have questions for you?
Yeah, so you can definitely find my work on Google Scholar or on ResearchGate. I'm not necessarily very active on social media or anything like that. I'm gonna go ahead and provide you with my email address, and if anybody wants to contact me, I bet you can put it in the show notes, my email address. If they want to contact me, shoot me an email. I'm happy to respond to emails. I'm happy to set up Zoom calls or anything like that to answer questions.
It's great. Thanks so much for joining us today, John. This was a really fun conversation for us. Good to get back on a call with you again and
Yeah.
catch up and hear more about the work that you're doing. And I personally just really grateful that there's someone out there doing the work that you are. So thanks on behalf of the exercise and general community for your work.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to be part of this. I think y'all are doing a great job with the platform and promoting physical activity and exercise training. It's really important. And I think the more places that people could hear about it and understand it, the more resources that are available, the more likely someone is to engage with it. So thank y'all for the work.
John, thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
This episode of the Medical Fitness Podcast is brought to you by the Medicine, Rehab, and Fitness Institute. The MRFI has been co-founded by medical, rehab, and fitness practitioners who see the medical necessity in getting people to be more active and fit. There is a sleeping giant of opportunity to building a more active population, an opportunity which lies in a more effective medical referral pathway to exercise programs and professionals equipped to serve that pathway. To learn more about our services and how we're working to make this a reality, visit mrfinstitute.org. That's mrfinstitute.org.